please welcome Dr. Peter Dieckman.
Thank you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very honored to have the opportunity to speak to you today here and to present a little bit of our work. It's amazing to see how many are there. Thank you very much for staying. So I would like to speak on the psychology of simulation. My conflict of interest statement, our institution, the Danish Institute for Medical Simulation, has a collaboration agreement with Lærdal, and representing my institution, I am heading the EU Sim group providing instructor courses. Our institution is a big training institute, but we also do research and development. We are part of the capital region of Denmark, train approximately 12,000 participants per year in the postgraduate era. Very different professions, specialities that we look at. I would like to talk a little bit about my angle to the topic. Psychology is something that you don't discuss in an afternoon. Simulation, you all know, is something that you also need a little bit more than an afternoon to discuss fully. So I will need to concentrate on some of the aspects, and I would like to describe the angle that I take. I appreciate that many of you, are working in very different areas. My own expertise, if I dare say that, is a mannequin-based simulation, but many of you work with standardized patients or also screen-based simulators, for example. So I will try to step back a little bit. I will work with alienation of some of the topics, and I hope I also will be able to link back to at least different areas of practice of simulation. I will try to pinpoint aspects, so I will use language as strong as I can and still make the point. I will exaggerate to a certain extent. I'm aware that many of the things that I will say might not be so clear in practice and might not be relevant for all of you, but I hope to make the point more clearly. So for some of the points I will mention, you might say, yes, that is something I have also experienced. Some of you might say, well, I can relate half to this, and maybe to some of the things I say, many of you would say, well, that's not relevant for me. So I'm curious to get your reactions on this. When I look at simulation in healthcare, I think it's a very complex interplay of many different things here, like a little bit chaotic thing. We have people, we have devices, we have phenomena in maybe a more abstract sense here. What I'm interested in doing is trying to understand different types of phenomena that are there, and maybe also trying to group them. What I'm not so much interested in is trying to count them. So how often does this specific phenomena occur? And I'm also kind of not very interested in the little stars that many studies would aim for. Sorry. So I'm more interested, again, in trying to see what are similarities, what are differences, what are the apples, what are the oranges, and then I think we can start counting them. So my perspective is more of a qualitative approach, but I would not slap you if you're working quantitatively. I will take the starting point in my own experience, also in the publications that we have written in the instructor courses that we have been doing around the world. So I don't offer like a scientific overview review of psychology. I will take my own experiences as a starting point and basically build on this, and then also try to link back. The aim of this, the lower part is published in the syllabus. My aim of the talk is basically to help you use some of the psychological principles to optimize simulation-based training. And I guess Adam and I have used the same Google search, I assume, to find the nutshell. What is psychology about? In a nutshell, you could say it's about describing, explaining, and predicting experiences and actions of people. And I will use examples from healthcare simulation to kind of try to do that. When you think about psychology, many of you might think about, use psychology, for example, to understand team processes. And then you train the team processes, or understand the mechanisms, psychological mechanisms, if they are there, of human error, for example. You could also think about psychology of simulation. So what are the experiences, what are the actions of people actually working in the simulation setting? And it is the latter sense that I would like to focus on. So I would try to describe, explain, and a little bit of a prediction also of how people will behave, how people will experience the work in simulation settings. Not only to please Ronnie Lewin with his call for more theory, I also like to honor, I think, one of the greatest psychologists of all time, actually also from Germany, Lewin, who immigrated also to the US. He's a great thinker. Some of the key points, and I will basically use his theoretical framework to base my talk on. Some of the key points of his thinking is that we have to look at the whole of the situation first before we can dig deeper into the smaller pieces. We also would need to understand the dynamic of a situation. What presents itself right now in a certain way might change considerably. When I ducked under the table, the room was empty. Now it's full, different experience. And also the psychological aspects of the situation very important, because we need to understand it. I'm a psychologist, so that's also the area that I'm interested in. If you summarize that, and that would be my conclusion of the talk. So behavior is a function of the person, P, and the environment at the same time. And I think very often we focus on the good or the bad apple, the person, or we think about the realism of the simulator, and it's the interplay, I think, that we need to consider. Let me give you a plastic example. If you go to a birthday party, the first piece of cake is great. The seventh might, kind of decrease in attraction. So if, for example, we think about things where you get too much, then the attractiveness of things change. So we need to consider them in context. Let me give you an example from your work, probably the silent participant. When you would consider the silent participant in more Asian cultures or in the US cultures, there might be a profound difference in how we experience that. In an Asian culture, a silent participant might simply follow the rules. In the Western culture, you would think as the instructor, oh, what did I say? And you might feel uncomfortable with this. So we need to understand this interplay between the person and the environment. Lewin has termed this, coined this term life space for this. The life space represented by this ellipse here and the person in it is basically everything that is right now aware, what you are aware of right now. Maybe you're thinking of checking into your flight and whether you get an aisle seat. Maybe you're hungry, maybe you're just interested in what I have to say, maybe the chair is uncomfortable. All these things are more or less aware to you right now. And the summary would be called the life space. The elements also have different value. Lewin called it affordances to kind of express this interplay between the person and the environment. Some of the things, is positive. If I think of the 9 hours flight back, that's not so positive. If I think of, my brilliant presentation, that's very positive. So the different elements in the life space have different value. Let's consider the example again of the silent participant. So if the instructor would be from the Western culture, you might have like a negative experience towards this person. You might be tensed, again, what did I do? How could I help this person also? In an Asian culture, potentially it might be that the instructor is simply happy that all the students are following the rules. These dynamics, these affordances are also dynamic. As I just said, things are changing, things are coming up, and so on. What is right now positive might be negative if you do it too often, for example. Actions in this model are modeled by movements, by locomotion. So basically the idea is the person moves towards the one thing that is accessible to them and has the highest positive value. The interesting thing is, on the other hand, the life space also has borders. Let me give you an example. You see somebody doing a mistake in the scenario, and in the debriefing you say, yes, I can correct the error, and you do this. You move towards this space in your life space, you kind of take the action of correcting the error, but then the consequence might be that your participant might get defensive, because maybe you have stated that in a way that was not helpful. So you get a border where you have to suddenly deal with this situation, the defensiveness of the participant, and can maybe not so freely move anymore because you kind of have created a problem. So there is borders between the actions, and some of them are stronger, some of them are weaker. A strong border would, for example, be for many of us probably not to let the patient die, because we don't have the time, so we don't do that. On the other hand, a weak border, whether you present this or that scenario first, maybe sometimes doesn't really matter so much, so you kind of can go over some of the challenges. Why do I show you all this? First of all, I think it's a brilliant model, and maybe you can keep it in mind when you run simulation settings. But basically understanding the life space of a person would mean to understand the actions and the behavior of a person. This is a little bit theoretical because we can never really uncover all the affordances in the life space, but in principle, some of the elements I think we can do. So I could also rephrase what I would like to do in the remaining time is to think about what elements of affordances are in the life space of instructors and participants. So who is influencing this? Stepping back, starting from an overview, from the whole of the situation, as Lewin would call it. It's your own organization, the person who pay you to run the courses, your commissioners, head of departments, the patients, relatives of the patient. So many people, and this list is not complete, would influence this. Jenny, I think, very nicely spoke about the organizational, the learning culture. This would also fall, for example, into this area here. And that, I think, is also a nice connecting point between our two talks. You spoke about resetting, for example. I would like to discuss a little bit more, what does that mean to reset from a psychological perspective, for example. So we have all these people influencing the actions and experiences. I would like to concentrate on the instructors and participants. When you do that, there is, again, a huge list that you could consider. Personality, dreams, fears, emotions, and whatnot. This is certainly not a complete list. It's just the idea, many, many things would influence this. And these three men here, amongst others, have kind of pointed out, don't forget the unconscious and also consider society. So this is Freud, Jung, and Fromm, kind of from the psychoanalytical perspective. The unconscious elements also play a role here, just to keep that in mind. This is a whole lot of things to consider. One way of trying to structuring that was the model that I developed for my dissertation, and what I called the simulation setting. You see the inspiration by Lewin with Dieckman, that is a homage to him also. But the idea is, any simulation setting, a typical simulation course, for example, would be divided in different phases, 8 here in this example, and the different phases would be connected. So let me give you the example, the lowest arrow, the connection between the setting introduction, where you explain what is simulation-based learning about, what is this course about. Depending on how you create the atmosphere in this scene, in this phase, it might very strongly influence how your debriefing is running. If you point out, we will check you in the beginning, your participants might be very defensive during the debriefing. If you create a learning atmosphere, then the participants might actually walk with you much more smoothly. Let's dig a little deeper and try to understand the experiences and the actions of simulation instructors. So one thing, probably a starting point, I guess, where we all would agree, we use simulation to make a difference for patients, for practitioners, for healthcare. We want to help people. That's probably what we all would like to do, right? Hands up who does not agree with this statement. Then out. If you don't do training, maybe you're doing research, maybe you assess people, but probably always with the same end goal in mind. I would like to dig a little bit deeper beyond this, what I could also call the marketing perspective. So what does that actually mean, to put all this into practice? And I will show you a few pictures now that in my mind kind of show some of the experiences that I have seen or also experienced myself in simulation. And I give you an interactivity warning, so I would like to invite you to basically tell me whether that is something that you recognize a little bit or really much. So depending, on how well you can relate to the thing that I show you, just please raise your hand further. So one thing, I think this feeling of creating awe. You run a simulation, and then there is this joy of recognition. The participants say, yes, that was like a real case of anaphylaxis, and actually they could feel the pulses, amazing. Anybody has this joy, when they say this? Wow, cool. Wow. Yes. Or, I was very inspired by the Puppet Festival in Copenhagen 2 years ago. The puppeteers also speak about it's great to play God, actually, to take control. So the fate on the fingertips, watching from your control room, the participants are struggling. Okay. Something that is very dear to me sometimes, unfortunately, I must say. Whole new character, payback time. All you anesthesiologists role-playing surgeons, physicians role-playing nurses, where you kind of overdo things and where it's just great to get rid of your past traumatic experiences in this extremely funny form. Or this year, the Adventure Playground, come to our center and experience what you never ever want to experience in the outside. It's cool to do that. Okay. Probably related, fear of boredom. If only they don't go home and say it was boring. So I think the last two, for example, is I think one of the elements why many scenarios are really dramatic. That you kind of focus on these emergency situations, kind of worst case things, where I also would think we probably can learn a lot from just, a little bit drop in blood pressure and how do we actually handle this, kind of the more normal things. I think we could also analyze much more, but I think there's many psychologically and other reasons to kind of go more for the fireworks scenarios. Maximum realism. Kind of how cool is that we can actually replicate that? Where I would then also ask, what is really relevant to show for your scenario? Which type of realism do you need to which extent? Something that Helge brought me to think about, thank you very much, the learning from errors and kind of the joy of correcting somebody. You sit in the debriefing, or maybe also the fear of correcting somebody. I know both elements, depending maybe also a bit on culture. Kind of, there was an error. Was there maybe something you potentially have done slightly different, do you think? Anybody said that before? I would like to show you another model, the inner voices by Friedemann Schulz von Thun. So the idea is probably you might know kind of the inner voices, the little angel, the little devil, sitting on the shoulders or wherever, eat the cake, no, don't eat it. Yeah. Well, sometimes the world is a little bit more than black and white, so you might have different inner team players. The helper, the inquisitor, the scientist, the honorable, the king. One thing might be interesting to explore inside of yourself, which inner voices do you bring to which situations? And then it's actually interesting if you meet people, maybe you meet a person that really triggers your inner helper. Please sit down. Should I explain it to you in a different way again? Do you want something to drink? Kind of where you really get into this mode, I want to help you. Maybe there's other persons who really trigger your inquisitor. And and the scientist and the king, maybe, where you kind of really think, where you get into conflict almost with the person. The interesting thing is action equals reaction sometimes. So if your king comes out or your inquisitor, maybe that triggers the king of the other person, and maybe it triggers it really, really much. And suddenly you have these discussions where you don't really understand how you could end up in such a strange conversation and in such a strange conflict, where sometimes it might be interesting to listen to your own inner voice and to maybe mentally make the role shift and to think what kind of other inner voices might the other person operate with, and maybe have the inner voices negotiate a little bit with each other, and then maybe you can kind of calm down. So my inner voices meet other people and vice versa. Just to connect the two models, you could certainly also think of these inner voices as the affordances in the life space. It's a little bit rough here, but we could think about this. Another element which I find extremely impressive, I know that myself, it's very nice to be part of a group, and the participants come to your course. So are you as the trainer part of the group, or are you outside? And how much do we want to be liked? How do we handle this very basic conflict that every trainer probably would have? How can I criticize you and still feel accepted by you as a person? And how much do I depend on this? Is that part of my professional roles? Do you need to like me? Or is it enough if I help you learn? And sometimes that might be in conflict, actually. So if I try to summarize this a little bit, the experiences of instructors in the simulation setting, I would argue not all of what we do is actually completely and only focused on creating learning opportunities. It has also something to do with establishing our own psychological safety. It has something to do with, polishing our self-esteem and stuff like this. So I think it's important to consider this, and becoming aware of these elements in our life spaces as instructors, as trainers, as facilitators, I think would be important to kind of grow into a professional role. Maybe using, for example, also some kind of supervision. Thinking break? Let's change perspective. Instructors are more or less there for the participants, so we should also consider them. So one element I think that many participants feel like when they know they go into this simulation room now, like this is hell on earth. And we actually did an interview study on this, where the participants told us, I'm here in the simulation room, I know you guys sit out there, and you push your little buttons, and I have to fight here. And my job is basically to defend myself. Or another element, when you go home and watch TV, it's probably one of the relaxing things that many of us do, we kind of forget that it's actually something that we had to learn. I mean, if you look at children, they don't understand movies immediately. That's why the Teletubbies kind of reduce complexity and help you understand what's going on. Maybe sometimes we have to do similar things in simulation to help participants learn to interact with this complex tool. We as the instructors have run the scenario 27 times, and we know the mannequin and all the challenges with the mannequin and how to work around them. Participants don't. If you have some kind of simulation where you sometimes need to make the transition, this is meant to be something else. If you have to check for the vital signs, for example, then the participants might not actually know how to do that, and they might get confused. So they need some time to learn it. Also, when you become more aware of a thing, I think the previous knowledge of a situation will help you to simulate that. Some of you might have seen Dogville, amazing movie. With just, it's a whole evening movie playing on a stage with just, walls drawn on the floor and a few pieces of walls, and you get the impression that this is representing a village. I think sometimes, if the participants don't have a lot of clinical experience, For them, it might be more difficult to actually reconstruct or construct a situation that you want to simulate. If on the other hand, if you're an experienced emergency physician and I explain the patient to you, polytrauma case with head bleeding, broken legs and so on, probably you already have a picture in your mind how this looks like. So we have to also consider how much do we need to help the participants to understand the situation in which we bring them. Yet another model, if you think about the cognitive load theory, you can think about, we all have somehow varying resources, mental resources, emotional resources, and so on. Let this line represent kind of the summary of resource that somebody has, maybe with a profound dip after lunch. And now we basically put load onto them when they come, for example, into the simulation. And I think it's very interesting to think about how much of the load is actually from the case, from the content, treating anaphylaxis, for example, and how much load is there from just using the simulator, treating anaphylaxis in a simulator. I think especially people who begin to work with simulation have a lot of load just from figuring out where do I find the damn medication and how do I call for help here. Before you in the beginning, you might have to think about those things very much, while later you can simply use the simulator and then concentrate on the content more. Or you might also design scenarios that by default might be boring, where the load is too low. Or on the other hand, where you have scenario where the sum of content load and simulation load is too high for the resources of the person, where we basically disconnect to them, that the case is too difficult and people just don't know what to do and stuff like this. If you also consider that there is at least two parts in content, and the picture gets even more complex. One is the clinical medical issues. In our center, we very much focus on the human factors, non-technical issues, however you want to call that. So if you have somebody who doesn't know to use the simulator, it's the second time that this person is somehow dealing with anaphylaxis, and you want to have them use S-bar and close the loop and think ahead and so on, you might figure out that might be too much a little bit for one scenario. So we have to really find out how to dose also, which I think is a very important element when you discuss with your commissioner. They probably want it all in half a day. Using media is also a social practice. I think that's very important. There's some rules here, I hope that is not too dangerous, gender stereotypically speaking here, but there is some rules, how we engage with certain media. Also, simulation has some rules that we need to observe. And I would just like to point out one of them, the broken fiction contract. The fiction contract, a term by Umberto Eco from Italy, professor for semiotics, also author of The Name of the Rose, for example, or Baudolino for simulation. I think great to read Baudolino. He writes about the fiction contract, and I found a nice example of what could happen if that doesn't work. So bang, you're dead. No, I'm not. You missed. I did not. You cheater. Well, I'm here standing to you, am I not? Okay then, bang. My, what a miserable shot you are. As long as this is no real pistol, you can increase the fidelity of the simulator as much as you want to. If those guys don't want to play with each other, it doesn't work. You can buy the fanciest simulator that is on the market and in the exhibit hall or wherever you find it. You can build the finest simulation center. If the participants don't agree that it makes sense to work with you, just forget it. If they do agree with you, you probably need a piece of wood or a sack of potatoes and it will work great. Let's try to summarize also here the experiences of the participants. So I think what's very important to consider, for many of them, there's much at stake. Kind of discussing openly your frame. I think it's a great thing to do and we should aim for that, but it's also a lot that we ask for people to discuss with us, their real motivations, their feeling, their thought processes, their norms, values and beliefs, how they can improve and so on. There's much at stake and we need to consider that. If the participants consider that it makes sense to work with you, if they trust you, you can go a long way with them. If they don't, you just walk alone. I think that's very important to kind of keep this connection in mind, even if that would mean to compromise on some of your learning goals, of downscaling, the level of ambition, for example. I would like to think a little bit about simulation practice as I see it. So one thing is kind of the mental representations. You might have a team of instructors here. They think about the case of anaphylaxis. The person here to your left thinks, anaphylaxis, let's do this. The instructor person, team member in the instructor team on the right says, but let's also add power failure. Anaphylaxis is too boring. Just, I had a power failure last week, so let's add this. So kind of one discussion, the level of ambition of the scenario. So then these two guys actually put it into practice, and the scenario looks similar, but also not completely as they planned it. So I think one of the interesting challenges sometimes, does the scenario that comes out to the participant actually reflect the scenario that we had in mind? Kind of the verification of our own scenarios is an interesting point. And then the other consideration is, what part do the participants perceive? Maybe, they think it's somehow anaphylaxis, but they're not really sure, looks slightly different. And the one person is completely blown away by the power failure and thinks about nothing else anymore. How could such a potential disconnect happen? So maybe you are working in an area where this is your clinical reality is full of clouds, you deal with emergency situations all the time and so on. And maybe it's also the idea of the commissioner, bring people to the edge, challenge them, and see what they can figure out of that. Maybe your participants, on the other hand, work in an area where there's more sunshine and occasionally a cloud coming by. And sometimes you might have a disconnect then in the content of the scenario, whether that's the clinical case or whether that's human factors issue. It might actually also be the other way around, human factors oriented. You kind of think everything is fine, but your participants might go through thunderstorms from this side all the time. So I think what's very important is to do a real good needs analysis, to do contract clarifications, and to potentially adapt scenarios and the whole simulation setting. Needs analysis, we have been talking about that actually before the actual IMSH in the faculty development symposium. In the moment, in our own center, level of needs analysis that is possible to say, well, that is consultants or this is first year residents, that is basically how fine-grained we can think about things. But what the different level within the group of first-year residents is, that is difficult for us to find out. So I think in principle we need more tools and more thinking about how can we actually do more fine-grained needs analysis in the sense of adaptive training. How do we, for example, take learner differences into account? Contract clarification, then maybe the commissioner asks you to run a communication training for his department people, but you see in the first course communication is not the issue. They new anesthesia machines, just as an example. How do you then balance what the commissioner is asking you for with the learning wishes or learning needs of the participants? I think that's something interesting to also all the time clarify. Adaptations then, just would like to point out one concept here, the idea of scenario lifesavers. So, you run a scenario or you have planned a scenario, anaphylaxis, but for whatever reason your participants think it's myocardial infarction. Then it's the question, does myocardial infarction still allow you to go with the learning goals? Are you good enough to change on the fly? Maybe you just forget your anaphylaxis scenarios and go with myocardial infarction and still have a relevant debriefing, and you never tell them that this was anaphylaxis in the first place. Maybe you need your scenario because the learning goal, that is the second case here, the learning goal is only reachable with this specific scenario, so we have to kind of bring them back on track. There is ideas of doing that. Sometimes the third case, they do something with the scenario where you cannot really deal with it anymore, then maybe you have to stop and restart. And I appreciate that, that many people would work with stop and restart techniques in itself, even though if participants don't do something unexpected. I would like to think about learning a little bit. That's also something that Lewin has looked into quite a bit. What does learning mean within this model here? Many of you might also be familiar with the Kolb's learning cycle, which is actually based on Lewin's cycle here. He has 3 stages in this: unfreeze, change, and refreeze. So if a learner comes to your simulation, they have certain habits, especially if they are working in their profession already. So at times you might actually have to unfreeze, you have to prepare them for learning. The borders in the life space basically would need to become a little bit fluid, for example. Then you discuss changes with them, and they hopefully would implement that, and then you can maybe train it, and that they can actually refreeze. So you have a scenario where the handover communication is a challenge, then you discuss the S-bar model. In the next scenario, you practice saying S-bar under various conditions. That could be one example for the cycle. How can you do this unfreezing? One way of doing this is to create a barrier situation where what you usually would do does not work anymore. So the lonely fighter, who's very good clinician, for example, gets into a situation where simply, no matter how good you are, it's not enough, you have no chance to solve this alone. And then, you kind of running through against the barrier here, so you have to find a new way, maybe drawing in your team members. The barrier helps you see a new way. Maybe it's also that you see somebody, with new eyes. By the role shift, for example, having the anesthesiologist role play the surgeon might give an idea of how much do you actually get in the role of the surgeon, of what is going on the anesthesia side. And many other constellations where you kind of would switch roles, where suddenly the understanding for the other person might actually be increased. I learned to see the situation with your eyes. Or, try something new. Maybe instead of going to the large plus here on your right, people might actually try to what would happen if you go to the plus on the left here behind the big borders. If you try that in reality, it doesn't work. You want to solve the case of anaphylaxis alone, even though that your experience level is not very high. Maybe you would like to do that, but your ethical principles prevent you from doing this. So there's borders in a learning situation. Hey, we have simulators. Let's work with this. Very old work here by Brown discussed the dynamic features of irreality planes. That is basically the simulation reality up here. And where the idea is simulation can be more fluid than the real world. So maybe actually in the simulation you could go here what you could not do in clinical practice. I heard from a colleague the example with the case of treating anaphylaxis, a young resident clearly not able to treat it by her own, but did also not call for the consultant. In the debriefing, then the discussion, maybe you should have called for the consultant. Yes, but I wanted to see how far I get. I know this is simulation, let me just try this. This is exactly, jumping over some of the borders. I think what's very important then, and I know that the debriefer also did that, kind of reality check. So does that make sense also in clinical practice? There you would call, right? Yes. So I think one of the great features of simulation is that we are able to play with these things. And I'm a big fan of making situations very different from how they might be in clinical practice, for example. But I think it's always then important to link back to what does that mean for your clinical practice. If I take the example with the role change, anesthesiologist role-playing a surgeon, or experienced physician role-playing a very inexperienced physician, I think it doesn't make sense then if I ask you as the consultant in anesthesia, so how did you feel as the young resident? The interesting challenge I could give that person is from you as the experienced person being in the role of the young resident, what did you learn for your role as the experienced person? We have to kind of adapt also the debriefing to what really matters, what are the relevant changes that are actually relevant for the everyday reality level. How can we do this also unfreezing? The idea of the matching disturbance. So some scenarios, simply might be too boring, or some debriefing things might be too boring. The disturbance is too small. The life space is not moved. Nothing happens. Yes, scenario, okay. You might, on the other hand, have disturbances and scenarios where your participants just leave. Whether they go crying out of your room, or whether they simply say, yes, you're right. Kind of these debriefings where they basically mentally disconnect and mentally go, and yes, you're right, and I have my peace. They leave the field. Or you have different reaction, a strong disturbance, and you really have the resistance. And then you fight about your scenario, and it was stupid to be here anyway, and I would have done something else. And then you try to defend, and you get into this circle where basically the resistance becomes larger and larger. So I think that the trick is to find the matching disturbance. You have something that really moves the person, the life space, and also the affordances that people might experience. And if you watch closely, there was a minus coming up. I think it's very important that sometimes these matching disturbances are all but fun. Some of my own personal learning experiences that I value the highest were moments where I said, that's true, but not very nice. And I think many of our people, and me included, we aim for fun simulations very often. It should be fun and great that you are here. And I think it makes sense to a certain level, not to scare people away, but I think real deep learning often is related to maybe not so positive emotions. These matching disturbances, I would argue, we have to find the decisive moments here. The Cartier-Bresson has termed this, coined this term. Split seconds before or after this picture would be worth. And I think there's often elements in simulation scenarios or debriefing that are decisive. I did not hear you say that, but I thought the IV line was in place. I did not know the people. We usually, would jump over them and say, yeah, okay, fine. But maybe it is an idea to really take them serious. So if you say you did not hear, you say that, how can this be? What is really the mechanisms behind this, to take it serious? What is happening in the here and now? Yes, at home you may have heard the other person, I don't care, but here you didn't. What can you do to make sure that this does not happen? So in this sense, to think about creating, recognizing and using learning opportunities really as a gift. And that helped me a lot to also see critical feedback as a gift, not to see it as a challenge to the person, but to say, I see something that I think you can improve. My intention is to help you improve your performance, so I would like to give you a gift, which is different from saying, hey, you're doing something wrong and I can correct it. So again, the frame behind the action here, is my intention to help the other person, or is my intention to enjoy the feeling of correcting an error? I think that's very important to step back sometimes and think, why do we do things? So to summarize here, not all in the interactions between instructors and participants might be fun, but still it can be very valuable to have the learning. I would like to use the last 5 minutes to step back a little bit from the simulation practice that I described in the last few slides here. So one thing, I think if you look at this unfreeze, change and refreeze cycle, I would argue that we are pretty good in unfreezing people. We are pretty good in running scenarios where they say, yes, I need to consider. Sometimes there's challenges with resistance and so on, but we are pretty good in doing this. I think we are also rather reasonably good in, changing. Not quite as good, I think. We see, well, leadership in this scenario was not very good, but then maybe sometimes we are not clear enough what actually in the leadership could help you to change. Which model of leadership would be helpful for you to try, for example. I think where we are then kind of weak sometimes is to help them refreeze. So kind of really apply what you learned now in the next scenario. What does that mean for your clinical practice? How can you take the leadership technique that you learned here with you? How can you, the algorithm that you have learned here, how can you implement that into practice? And I think it has something to do with, it's rather easy to unfreeze people. It's also still rather easy to discuss possible changes with them. But I think it's pretty hard to actually work with people on this detailed level where the devil is in the details. So how do you implement S-bar with your colleagues who have no clue what that means and really hate if you say something? How do you do this? Let's step back even further. I'm very impressed by another German psychologist, who's a psychoanalyst also, who talks about the illusion of competence and dissolving limits in our modern societies. And I wonder, many checklists are out there. We all strive to assess competence. We want to show that simulation works by, for example, assessing competence on checklists on whatever. And I think in principle that all is a good strategy because maybe we don't have good other tools in the moment. But I wonder whether there is a negative side of this where the checklist value gets its own life. And where kind of having a good checklist value replaces your ability to meaningfully interact with other people, to meaningfully take care of patients, to meaningfully kind of implement treatment and diagnostics. You are checked off. You're certified, but maybe sometimes that is not the whole picture. We actually did an interview study looking here at ALS courses, ACLS courses, where we had interviewed people, and where people said, well, after the course, I really feel prepared. I got the certificate. I was comfortable with my decisions. When there's a code, I felt prepared for that. When actually the implementation then, it's a different person, I must say, but in the implementation then was kind of, I remember when I came back to medical ward, and I was working there, initially I tried to use this structured approach, but then the nurses here, just as an example, kind of put my attention on a different spot, which kind of kicked me out of my structure, and then I had difficulties applying it anymore. So the conclusion of our study was that the efficiency dimension of these courses, of these checklist-based courses, is probably pretty strong. You learn how to do it if everybody follows the same algorithm. But what's called the innovative dimension of how do I actually implement that in the ill-structured world of healthcare, as David Garber might call it, that dimension is weak. So if only half of the people know what you mean when you say code blue or something, then the word code blue doesn't help you that much. So how do we actually prepare people to implement it under challenging conditions? How do we make sure that they kind of have these meaningful conversations? I'm working with this algorithm, do you as well? No? Okay, which algorithm do we use? These things. And maybe sometimes there's a challenge that actually checklists or certification become get in the way of this meaningful conversation. As we also saw in our study, there was a thing, are you not certified? Mm-hmm. This in-group, out-group thing. I only accept you if you have the certificate. Instead of saying, you can maybe help me, let's try to find out. Maybe also sometimes it could be an element in, the silos of care. Who is certified, who is not? My last thought here, basically, dissolving borders. Some of you, I like Photoshop. Some of you might do as well. I think it's amazing that, if I look in the mirror, or maybe you have similar experience, you never look like these Photoshop person, right? And slowly our perception, I think, of real people is changing over time with, seeing all these Photoshop people and just looking great to whatever standard of looking great you compare this with. And I think, and that is a hypothesis, that we might be on a way to do similar things in simulation, where you might get actually too fine-grained at times. You didn't close the loop here, you didn't close the loop there, you didn't close the loop here, and you didn't do anything for 20 seconds. Where probably in real world, 5 minutes would also still be okay. And I think, again, we need to consider this. What type of situations do we throw people in? And where does it make sense to really take this as a decisive moment? Where is 20 seconds really too long? And where is it maybe also something, because you didn't see anything else to discuss, where you just then kind of dig in more deeply. Raising the bar maybe sometimes too high. So kind of, again, this reality check also of the scenarios that we do. Maybe there's also blind spots. I mentioned earlier the discussion of, should patients die in the simulator or not? There's, I think, good arguments back and forth, which learning goals and so on. But I'm actually interested in this blind spot here. There's actually seemingly countries that use this as a warning sign on the streets. I found that impressive. Is there something in the overall practice that we do, that we shy away too much from negative emotions? We talk about, for example, crisis resource management. And most of our scenarios are somehow happy end scenarios. And I think, again, that makes sense because that helps the psychological safety and so on. But as you know much better than me, there is probably situations where you simply cannot manage, or you did all that you can and the patient still suffers or even dies. And I wonder whether we can use simulation also to address these issues more. What do you do if you're really helpless in a situation? How do you deal with your own feelings of inappropriateness, with your flaws, with chaos, and so on? I'm not saying that all the scenarios should end like this, but I think that is a blind spot where we can cover a relevant part of the actions and experiences of people in the real world also during simulation. I think we should kind of take this into account more. And there were also sessions here during the meeting. I was very grateful to attend one great session on this topic. So I think the discussion also comes up, but I think there's an area where we should also kind of maybe not shy away from, so to say. With this, I would like to try a summary. So, to describe actions and experiences in the simulation setting, I think the psychological perspective is necessary / helpful. I'm not saying it's the only one. I'm well aware, that there's many different perspectives, but especially for instructor facilitators, it's probably a very good idea to see, to do a psychological analysis of the situation. Not all what people are doing is actually inside of the simulation is influenced only by the situation itself or by the learning goals itself. It has something to do with keeping faith and so on, with kind of keeping your inner voices, your inner team in line. So it has also kind of egoistic motives. Instructors and participants need to learn to use simulation as a complex medium and to agree on the rules of social practice. Change or learning here probably needs the matching disturbances so that you actually do change your life space. And not all of the time this will actually be fun. You might go home, say that was the best course I ever had, but you might be in tears while you say that. And I think it's very good sometimes that things like this happen. If people cry for the right reasons in a simulation course, I would be happy as an instructor. I would not be happy if they cry because I screwed up. Considering the blind spots or unwanted effects also of simulation from time to time, maybe stepping back a little bit and really questioning the foundation of what we are doing might actually be helpful to go on and develop simulation further. And in this sense, go out and change the world and check PsycInfo, the equivalent to PubMed for psychological works, also when you do a reference list. Thank you very much for your attention.